Then there's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, their legislative priorities, opinions, and perspectives that help make California exceptional. Happy New Year. I'm Brian Green. The California coastline is roughly 1,200 miles long. The sandy beaches, the rocky crags, the tide pools, and the beautiful Pacific Ocean that embraces it have been a point of pride for poets, musicians, lovers, photographers, coastal residents who relish living near it, indigenous communities who depend on it to survive and thrive, and environmentalists who fight to protect it. But the coastline, not just California's, but others around the world, has become one of the most hazardous places to be in this era of climate change. According to scientific projections, the ocean stands to rise 7 feet by the end of the century, with predictions of fierce storms and high tides that could upend the lives of entire communities. And even over the recent holidays, the high and crashing surf in Ventura sent 8 people to the hospital, not to mention the additional coastal damage that we saw up and down the state. So many people in California, living in towns and cities on the coast, face those risks right now. And their history, their wealth, and their personal and political choices that they make today will shape how they survive as the water inevitably comes to their collective doorstep. On this edition of Then There's California, we'll focus on the subject of sea level rise and how our state, in particular, is dealing with those environmental and political challenges, both historic and current. We're joined by a state senator who represents one of California's premier coastal districts and who has been one of the legislature's foremost leaders in the field of environmental protection, and a California journalist and Pulitzer Prize finalist who has written a book, both sobering and lyrical, on the climate chaos that threatens the coast that we love so fiercely and our collective capacity to change it. State Senator Ben Allen represents California's 24th Senate District, covering the West Side and Hollywood and the coastal South Bay communities of Los Angeles, a district that he grew up in. And for purposes of this conversation, it is important to note that Senator Allen is the chair of the Senate's Environmental Quality Committee and co-chairs the legislature's Environmental Caucus, among his other points of leadership. Senator Allen last joined us on this podcast in the summer of 2022 when he and environmental advocates across the globe were celebrating the passage of his SB 54, groundbreaking legislation to address plastics pollution. And we are here in Senator Allen's district office in the 24th in El Segundo, right here on Southern California's beautiful coast. Senator Allen, great to see you again. Welcome back.
Good to be back. It's so good to be back on the show. Welcome to LA.
And joining Senator Allen in this conversation is Rosanna Shaw, an environmental reporter for the Los Angeles Times. She is, as mentioned, a celebrated 2020 Pulitzer Prize finalist for explanatory reporting, and she is most recently the author of California Against the Sea, Visions for Our Vanishing Coastline. Truly one of the most compelling and insightful and environmentally focused books that has been written in a generation. And that is no cheap praise, I promise you. A book that serves both as a retrospective on the political, emotional, and existential history of our California coastline and what our past and current actions mean for its and our future survival. Exceptional book. Rosanna Shaw, really nice to have you with us.
Thank you for hosting this conversation.
Happy to do it. And really, before we get into this, I want to go fanboy on you real quick about your book. I've read it 3 times now, admittedly a couple of times, mostly just to make sure I sounded halfway intelligent in this conversation. But for starters, I love the double meaning title, California Against the Sea. We are against the sea like we're right next to it, but we're also constantly pushing against the sea.
Thank you. I mean, the joke I had with my editor for years, because it took me so long to write this book, that the title would be California in the Sea by the time I finished writing it.
That's right. And again, I'm not trying to over-exaggerate this. I think you belong in that same pantheon as Rachel Carson, the naturalist who wrote Silent Spring and the effects of toxic chemicals on our environment. But she really loved the sea. She loved the tide pools. She loved the fish and the water. And actually, before she died in the early 60s, one of the things that she wanted to get into was sea level rise. And so I think that you could be filling that space and continuing her legacy with the work that you're doing with this book.
Thank you. That I'm really touched to hear that. I mean, Rachel Carson is a legend for all environmental writers, and she is a personal hero and someone who I have turned to for, inspiration whenever I'm stuck and having writer's block.
I'm sure Senator Allen concurs, especially the fact that you've definitely profiled him in this book. I know he's a big fan of the work that you're doing as well.
Yeah, I got to say, I have been plowing through this book, and it's filled. There's so much substance to it. There's a lot of poetry, and I like the fact that you take the moment many times to explain how it is and why it is that various activists and people who came into this story of protecting the coast, what brought them to their love of the coast. And it's oftentimes a personal anecdote, an experience when they were young, a moment of magic. And those moments interplay through the book, and it's a wonderful reminder of what is so special about our coast here in California.
And it actually was this book that prompted me to bring you both together here. And so I want to start out by giving you both a chance to be reflective and personal, to just answer what does our coast, the sand, the sea, the proximity to it mean to both of you? One of you a lawmaker, an environmental advocate, and the other a journalist and a researcher, but also as Californians. I guess I'll start with you, Senator. What does the coast mean to you?
I mean, it really is such an important part of being a Californian. I grew up here. Both of my parents came from other places. My dad was from England, my mom from New England. And they moved to Santa Monica, a beautiful coastal town. And it just became an important part of my life. My dad would go on a run along the beach and I'd go swimming. I usually have my little boogie board and ride the waves for hours and hours in the summer. We'd go hiking in the Santa Monica Mountains, and so often there'd be the beautiful view of the ocean below us. We explored the state. It's just a magical piece of open space where people can go and visit. And I see this with my wife, who's from Ohio, who just finds so much solace with going down to the ocean and walking the ocean, biking the ocean. It's just such an important outlet for people, an important place of peace, an important place of spirituality, and I appreciate it a great deal. It's a wonderful thing about being Californian.
And Rosanna, I know you have a very detailed reaction to that too, but what does the coast mean to you?
Yeah, and I love hearing Senator Allen's personal reflections on this, because the fun thing about being the coastal reporter for the LA Times is that I do get to experience the coast through so many people's perspectives and through so many of their own personal stories and connections to the coast. But I guess to build on kind of what Senator Allen just said, I'll geek out for a second on just the landscape. I mean, the coast to me is truly incredible in terms of, from a geologic perspective, from kind of an ecosystem perspective. We have cliffs in California. That's really special about the West Coast opposed to a lot of the East Coast. And that is the cliffs themselves just remind me constantly that we are on the edge of two massive tectonic plates. And that's why we have earthquakes. And on top of that, just we're built on river plains and the marshes and wetland systems. And the outer coast of California is more than 1,200 miles long, and the dozens of cities and counties and communities, each of them with their unique stories and social histories and political histories. I mean, just, from a storyteller perspective, I feel like there are just so many unique things to say about each place and every inch of the coast, but also collectively it adds up to this broader social and political and economic and natural landscape that really means something intrinsically to all of us as Californians. And there's just something really, from a narrative perspective, so fascinating about both the micro and the macro of the California coast.
And I suppose it's the instinct to protect it. You used a Chumash Native American phrase, if I'm pronouncing it right, the Kaiskaman, that it's our coast and we want to heal it and we want to love this earth that is ours, which I found was very compelling.
Yeah, that collective sense of our not in a ownership perspective or to control. And the coast is a broader public good. I mean, we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, later in the podcast, but we have made a philosophical stand as Californians that the coast cannot be owned by anybody and therefore belongs to everybody. And I do find it fascinating. Every person I talk to has an expectation of what they want for the coast and out of the coast. And so many of those interests and needs and values are in conflict with each other. And that in itself is many of the points of tension that we're feeling now as sea level rise threatens a lot of what we love and hold dear. But it's also a really interesting moment for us to reflect on what it is that we actually want from this broader public good and this natural landscape that has become so core to our identities as Californians.
Do you remember when the first time was you saw the coast, the ocean? I know you're from the East Coast, so maybe that wow moment when you first saw it?
Yeah, so this is really funny. I feel like I have been avoiding this question for so long because as the coastal reporter for the LA Times, I've felt imposter syndrome for so long. I feel like everyone assumes that I love to surf and that I'm a water baby and that I grew up by the ocean. But I would say that, I grew up in Massachusetts, and my love for the ocean really was discovered very late in life. And I mean, growing up in Massachusetts, it's like the world of privatized beaches. And my parents were new to the country when I was young, and, figuring out how to get to the beach was just the last of their priorities at the time. And so, I think I did go to Cape Cod a few times by the time I was in high school and learned how to drive. But it really is a system where you have to know someone who knows someone who knows someone who owns a house in Cape Cod or Martha's Vineyard to really experience the beach in the way that so many Californians get to experience just by driving out to Santa Monica or Malibu. And so I think my first memory truly of the ocean and of the beach was when I moved to Los Angeles as an adult. And I remember, driving cross country and just going straight to Santa Monica and just being blown away by how wide the beach is and just truly how many people were there and how many people just really feeling, wow, this is a place that people go to every single day, that this is part of daily life here. And I remember years later, someone telling me or making the observation that, Los Angeles doesn't have a central park. There's no public gathering space like that in LA, but the beach is truly our public square. And I really felt that public square energy the first time I stepped foot on a beach in Los Angeles and saw the ocean for the first time.
That's beautiful. Well, Senator Allen, you grew up here. I don't know if you even remember the first time you saw the coast. You were probably a little kid, but any experiences or reflections on that magical first moment?
It is magical. And I guess when you do grow up here, maybe you do take it a little bit for granted. And that was one of the neat things about the book was to see the coast for the first time through the eyes of these various people that Rossana highlighted. For me now, as an elected official, as a legislator, it was interesting for me to reflect on how much I did and do take coastal access and coastal protection for granted as a Californian. And being reminded of the story of those people who stepped up when things could have moved in a very different direction and provided for coastal protection and coastal access through the Coastal Act and the Coastal Commission and all the work that's happened ever since. And all of us have our little gripes with things the Coastal Commission does from time to time. But the core mission of the Coastal Commission and the Act and all of the work that we've all done collectively, and we're really on the standing on the backs of past giants, is something I think it's easy to take for granted, and yet it's good to be reminded because it's good motivator for those of us working in the public sphere. These things are the way they are because people fought for them, and they really used politics and the law and public opinion to put in place a system that has created this birthright that we all now have as Californians, and it's not something we should take for granted. And it was a good reminder for me.
Anybody who's listened to this podcast for a long time remembers our conversations about your son, Ezra. And I imagine you're seeing a little bit of that love, the love of it through his eyes.
Totally.
Right?
It's such a special place to take a kid. Actually, I was reading your section about Laguna Beach and we just went to Laguna Beach with my son, and just to have him running around and enjoying the sands and the tide pools and getting to see the beach again through the eyes of a child as a dad is a very special experience too, because it really does recreate the magic for me that maybe I become a little inured to.
Rossana, in your book, you point out how people often talk about the beach as a thing, as a place, as an area that doesn't move. And you've already touched on this a little bit. But in reality, you say the beach is more of a process and also has a physical edge, a spiritual edge, an unstable edge. Again, this is really a lyrical book. So expand on that a little bit.
Thank you. I mean, I think one of the most mind-expanding whoa moments in the process of weaving this book together is truly understanding and seeing the fact that the coast itself is not static. And that is something that so many people today still think is true. And that's the truth of the coast, that, you go to the beach and that beach is supposed to look the same the next time you come back, or that parking lot is still supposed to be there the next summer that you're there. But, the coast in reality is always moving, or it's supposed to move. And it's this edge where land meets the most massive body of water on the planet. And it's a process. There's this constant tension and dance between land and water. Yet the way we have built our environment today, whether it's Pacific Coast Highway or the Surfliner or entire neighborhoods and communities right on the sand, we have attempted to impose permanence onto this inherently impermanent space. I mean, if you go out to the beach and truly just slow down and pay attention to the tide line, that tide line is different every time the wave crashes ashore, right? And then you look kind of behind you and you look at the fixed infrastructure and the ways we have tried to fix this line in the sand, so to speak. That is the heart of a lot of the problems that we're facing now. The ocean is moving. It's always been moving. It's now moving inland faster and more frequently due to a lot of the causes of climate change. And we're not quite ready to decide whether or not we want to continue holding these lines in the sand or whether we want to acknowledge that the coast is supposed to move. It's inherently supposed to move, and we're actually supposed to move with it.
And you also remind us how California's shoreline, similar to the land it is adjacent to, was largely built on violence. And again, that is a very sobering thought, too. Explain that legacy and its connection to this built-in California attitude of wanting to lay claim and control the shoreline, and ultimately how our individualism is clouding our ability to address these coastal erosion and sea level impacts. And we've even seen it right here in Southern California with Bruce's Beach and other places. But I'll let you comment on that, Rosanna, and I'll get some comment from the senator on that, too.
Yeah. How much time do we have? Something I say often to journalism students interested in environmental journalism, I'll just start with that, is just that writing about the environment, you can't write about the environment in a silo. Writing about environment is ultimately about writing about land use policies, and our land use history is inseparable from our social history. So if you look at our past practices of redlining and where we chose to industrialize the shoreline versus where we chose to invest in tourism and building out residential communities, all of these decisions are interconnected with the social inequities we see today. And it's also all interconnected with our history of who we've pushed out and priced out from living along the coast. And not to get too radical, but but our settlement patterns, our settler mindset is what got us into the situation we're facing today. If you really drill in on what we're fighting about, and for me, this was a years-long process of just talking to people and really getting to the heart of some of these 8-hour public comment periods at city council meetings and truly thinking about the points of tension and what we're actually debating. What are we actually fighting about? It's property lines. We're trying to maintain property lines and jurisdictional boundaries when the ocean doesn't care about any of these lines that we have drawn up in our modern society. And if you look to the indigenous perspectives that had long been overlooked and often erased from these conversations, it becomes even more clear how the way we've built the world as we know it today, whether it's lining the Los Angeles River with concrete or building seawalls to hold back the ocean, all of this is rooted in this settler mindset of trying to control and conquer nature.
And I know you've seen this in this district in the beaches here in Southern California, with Bruce's Beach in particular, a family that owned this at the turn of the century, African-American family, a black family, and it was essentially taken away from them by the local government. And finally, it wasn't until just this last couple of years where the deed was given back to the family. Do you want to talk a little bit about how this violence plays out here on the South Coast?
Yeah, obviously, the story of Bruce's Beach is a really ugly story of racism, of a family who was dispossessed through an aggressive and racist campaign of intimidation and ultimately seizure of their land through an eminent domain process, but with such a problematic story that ultimately I'm very proud that we've been able to make reparation and ensure that the family is now going to be able to be made whole after given the incredible loss of generational wealth that they experienced as a result of the taking of that beach. That's one of many, many stories. Rosanna's right. California was settled by people largely who came in from elsewhere, whether it was the Spanish, Mexican, or then the American settlers who came in and believed in inherent right of land ownership. This is how our state was largely settled. This is how our towns and cities were built. By the way, in an interesting twist, there's another book which I recommend everyone as well. We can be the next podcast together. The King and Queen of Malibu, which is the story of the Rynch family. That's an interesting example of how this drive to lay claim to a piece of this coastline in private hands ended up helping to protect that stretch of land until we could get to this era where we actually start to believe again in public ownership and all of the rest. Because ultimately they wanted to keep visitors out. They wanted to control a vast swath of land. That's, of course, very contrary to the ethos that we have today that's enshrined in the Coastal Act and the Coastal Commission's work. But that drive to prevent access actually slowed development and allowed the notion of the coast as a public good to grow and take hold. Now, of course, that notion of private property, this right to the coast, is making it difficult for us to make some more smart choices about where we should actually continue to grow our communities and where we should think about alternatives. One of the things I love about this book is it really does take something that we all take for granted as Californians and really forces us to think about both the change, the violence of the sea and how unforgiving it can be, but also how the violence of some of our own land policies and how unforgiving it has been to many people, certainly the Native Americans and Native peoples who lived up and down our coast, but also families like the Bruce family.
Oftentimes, the shoreline, the ocean plays, I'll even say, a third fiddle to wildfire and drought when it comes to climate change debate. And Rossana, in her book, has described the ocean as a hero in a burning world. And as the world gets hotter and we think about how much heat the ocean is absorbing, what is happening to our coast and sea? Rossana, how are we altering it? What does it mean for the future?
Yeah, I mean, just to step back and provide some of the key numbers, I mean, every time I talk to a marine scientist or a coastal scientist or an oceanographer, so many folks have told me sea level rise in many ways is the heart of climate change. I mean, the ocean has absorbed more than 90% of the excess heat from our excess carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution. And the ocean is also a provider of so much oxygen on our planet. So we think a lot about emissions on land and in the atmosphere, but truly the ocean has absorbed so much of it. And, warm water expands. Warm water takes up more volume. Warm water is what is also melting a lot of our ice sheets. And if you look at the sea level rise projections just for the California coast, we're looking at as much as 7 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. And, that number I've been saying for quite some time now. And what's interesting, I'd be curious to hear what Senator Allen thinks, but just this idea of talking about 2100 and end of century has felt too abstract for some people. And I've been seeing kind of this movement within the science community to move that timeline up. And so for the last couple of years, I feel like the Ocean Protection Council and the Coastal Commission and a lot of folks have kind of reframed the planning and policy to okay, let's plan for 3.5 feet by 2050. That's probably a little bit over what will actually happen, but let's be over prepared, 3.5 feet by 2050. So that was kind of the framework for a couple of years. And now I'm hearing a lot of scientists talk about, no, let's talk about the 2030s. I mean, if you look at just what happened in January of 2023, where we have compounding disasters. That's kind of the new term I'm hearing a lot in the science community. You have atmospheric rivers, extreme precipitation, flooded rivers, and a rising ocean and rising groundwater and systems at capacity that can no longer hold all this water or flush this water into the ocean. This is going to happen in greater and greater frequency. And as one scientist put it, the 2030s get really scary really fast. And so I think it's been this really interesting shift from long scale timelines to really moving it to the midterm and now ultimately to the short term. And I think talking about frequency and compounding effects, we don't have to wait until 3 feet of sea level rise happens for the realities of sea level rise and flooding to really hit our coast and all our coastal communities.
Can you comment on that, Senator?
Well, it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. And I think, the folks down in Florida are starting to realize what a problem they're in and how there's such a disconnect between some of the rhetoric of their leaders with the basic realities of what a city like Miami faces right now or the Keys. You're right. It's more difficult for people to get their head around the question of sea level rise than things like wildfire or drought. I suppose there's this perceived immediacy, maybe because we've dealt with fires and droughts through human history, and there are things that the human mind can access more quickly and efficiently, and the amygdala kicks in with more ferocity, where sea level rise seems like such a slow-moving process. And it's very real for the people living on the coast, as your book does a good job of describing.
But it's also not when the sun comes out and people forget about it until the next flood.
Exactly. So it's one of the many challenges we have in the climate debate, because the lizard brain does not do well with slow-moving disaster. It's one of the big problems we have in the environmental policy space.
Well, that's actually was going to be one of my questions. Is it harder politically to get leaders and your colleagues to pay attention to sea level rise when they're worried about the fire in the foothills or running out of water?
Of course. And we see this in polling. We see this in legislation. It's hard to get people to focus on this because it doesn't feel as immediate.
And this is where I'm going to be probably like the cynical journalist in the room. And I feel like I am talking to a fellow kind of person working in the environmental space. I mean, I hear this so much that talk to any environmental person, like person working in environmentalism, you can separate climate action into two categories, mitigation and adaptation. And so often for folks kind of new to climate or thinking that we're doing climate work, the two get conflated. So mitigation is, efforts to stop or slow the effects of global warming, whether that's the, net zero emissions and electric vehicles and the clean energy transition. But all the work we're doing to stop and slow down actually like climate change getting worse, versus adaptation, which is acknowledging all of the things that are going to happen regardless of whether or not we stop emissions today, because so much of it has been baked in based on everything we've already put into the atmosphere. And so for me, sea level rise very much is an adaptation conversation, because again, even if we slowed all emissions right now, the sea is going to continue to rise. If you look at the projections through 2050, it's about the same, because like imagine just like, putting a ship on neutral like that and trying to steer it. It's going to keep going for a bit before you can turn and shift directions and shift paths. And like what we do with mitigation today will affect how bad it gets at the end of the century. But it's just interesting to me because I'll hear a lot of folks say like, oh, California is doing great on climate, or like, oh, I've supported a lot of climate actions. But, if you don't separate mitigation and adaptation, I think California talks great talk and does walk the walk on a lot of mitigation efforts. But when you talk about adaptation, forcing people to really start thinking about the changes they need to make in their lives to respond to the consequences of climate change, that's where it gets politically sticky, I would say. And I would say it's where the costs and the finances come out, and the who pays question and who has to do this first. And for me, like really living in the space of adaptation, climate adaptation, and kind of removing the climate mitigation aspect of the conversation, that's where you realize we are behind in California on adaptation in so many ways, even though if you talk about climate action very generally, like we're doing great on a lot of the mitigation efforts. I mean, we also should be doing a lot more on mitigation, but the separating the two, I think, really allows us to explore the nuances of climate action in a way that really pinpoints where we are stuck and where we are behind.
That obviously rings true for you, right? Everything she's saying.
So much so. I mean, then this will, of course, one of the big topics that Rossana talks about in the book is the grim choices that communities are facing along the coast as they are trying to figure out what to do. People have put their life savings into buying and developing property on the coast, beautiful places. People of great means, and then some people of modest means, depending on the community, depending on the type of house. And we know that those houses are going to be increasingly threatened, and people really will go to great lengths to protect their homes.
And their property lines.
And they're, yes, for all the obvious reasons. And that's where you start to see the proliferation of seawalls and folks hiring lawyers to push back and fight against various attempts to adapt. It's become very difficult in town after town to really grapple with this reality of sea level rise and all of the enormous implications, the infrastructural, physical implications. And it's something we face in a very real way along the entire coast.
And Senator, obviously, sea level rise has been a priority for the legislature this past year and in years past. Senator John Laird actually this last year had a bill. He also represents California's coast. SB 272 was his bill. And in short, it calls on every local government in the coastal zone to develop a sea level rise plan by 2034. And of course, we can't forget back in 2021, there was also SB 1 by our Senate leader, Pro Tem Tony Atkins, the Sea Level Rise Mitigation and Adaptation Act of 2021, which provides tools and resources for communities to address the impacts of sea level rise. And a lot of that is already starting to be felt in our coastal areas. And you, Senator Allen, authored unprecedented legislation also in 2021, SB 83, and then most recently in last year's session, SB 1078, that called for this revolving voluntary loan program that would essentially give local governments the ability to buy up properties at the risk of going underwater in the decades ahead, and then rent them at market value to pay off the loan. And this goes back to eminent domain debates that are going on in some of these cities and counties we're talking about here in California on the coast, giving people the chance to move on their own terms and sell their beachfront properties if they still have value, not a buyout, but a mechanism of investing. Both bills, both times passed out of the legislature, both vetoed by the governor, who said, at least the first time, that it wasn't comprehensive enough. So you've tried this twice. What's your reaction here as a coastal lawmaker to what you're trying to do?
Yeah, we really worked hard to make it thoughtful, careful. It was voluntary. We structured it in a way that it would be no net loss to the state. You're absolutely right. The idea here is these are properties with incredible value right now. That value is going to diminish over time. These homeowners are fighting like crazy for good reason, for reasons I totally understand, to push their local governments to invest more and more money in pushing back the sea through seawalls and all sorts of other types of mitigation. And it's creating impossible political situations in these towns. And yet we know we'll never be able to defeat the sea. And so the idea here was, let's create an optional program, buy the properties, then we can rent out the properties at a high rate to pay off the purchase, making it, in the end of the day, much easier to help folks get away from these dangerous properties on the coastline. And we thought it was an elegant and carefully crafted solution to this very real political and infrastructural problem that is plaguing a number of our coastal communities. I lament the fact that we weren't able to get the governor to see the value of this. I mean, we built a very strong bipartisan coalition. We tried twice. We rejiggered the bill somewhat to try to respond to the issues raised in his veto message, tried to reach out. I think now that we're having this conversation, it makes me want to try for it again. So see if there's a new way we can try to take another run at this, because there really is wisdom in this. But I will tell you, the value of this idea will diminish over time. If we don't do something like this now, it won't be worth doing in the future, because in the end of the day, it won't pencil out. The whole value to this is that we've got time before these properties get taken over by the sea, that you could then recoup the loss. And I just think to myself, if we'd had the foresight to invest in forest health 2 decades ago, what could have been saved in life and property? The good news is these are problems that we see clearly out into the future, and we can take action now to adapt in smart ways. And I hope that through this type of journalism, these kinds of conversations, the sort of advocacy that went behind these bills and other bills, that we'll be able to get more and more of our decision makers to see the wisdom of early action. It will pay dividends in the future if we're able to take this sort of action now.
Yeah, I was really fascinated by your proposed legislation. And also, I know that you had worked with a bunch of researchers at UCLA to really fine tune some of the mechanics. And I would say like a number of folks in the climate adaptation space were also really fascinated by kind of how you fleshed out the details of how this buyout and rent back kind of framework would work. And I think what I heard from a number of folks kind of in this research space, they said that they were really struck by, and they made this really important point to note here, that we often think either in the short term or the long term, this idea of what we need in the short term, what would feel like easy political wins, what feels more urgent and in need of like immediate response. And then there's like all these long-term needs, and knowing that on some gut level, like all of us know that life and the world as we know it and our communities and our infrastructure is going to look different somehow 60, 70, 80 years from now. But we also know that we don't need to make any of those changes today. And so how do you enter this middle space between short-term needs, short-term wants, short-term demands, and urgency, and kind of understanding that we need to move and transition towards this long-term, and navigating that middle space? No one has figured that out in a way that has like felt politically palatable. And again, adaptation, as you've shown too, is a harder sell than championing, let's stop climate change and global warming and let's do all these things to really, really reduce our emissions footprint, which is truly important. But again, like how do we navigate this middle space? And I think that what you presented was really fascinating. And I know I spoke to so many researchers who were just fascinated by this idea of, again, turning sea level rise response, not like, so many people still think of sea level rise as a one-time action, a massive, scary one-time action that demands lots of costs and sacrifices, rather than seeing it as an ongoing process of planning, of re-envisioning, of moving towards a different future that we all know, again, on some gut level will happen at some point. And I'm actually thinking of A.R. Siders, who's this, renowned climate specialist at University of Delaware's Disaster Research Center. She told me once, it's kind of like, how do you get people to eat broccoli today so that they won't get a heart attack 70 years from now? You don't really get political points for making people eat broccoli, but that's really kind of where we're stuck. How do you get people to start making that investment early so that the disaster and the heart attack doesn't happen 70 years from now? So yeah, I was really struck by your efforts to kind of enter that middle space that so many people have not really like touched yet. And that's truly, I feel like, where a lot of our local communities are stuck and where the local politics and the flashpoints and the backlash has been happening.
I read your reporting on this with several of your colleagues in the LA Times. You guys did a whole section on this. And I really felt for those local leaders. I served in local government myself. I know how intense these battles can get. And they were sitting there looking at how much they were being asked to spend of their meager municipal resources on basically a losing cause, right? Fighting the sea. And that was money that could be going to parks. It could be going to helping people relocate. It could be going to senior programs, youth programs, et cetera. And yet nobody wants to hear it right now. I mean, and I think everyone wants to think, oh, let's just fight climate change and everything will be better. And I certainly we need to do that. But we know that some of this, at least, is an inevitability. It's sad to say, but we've gone past. There are several points of no return, I suppose, and we've gone past a couple of them. It doesn't mean that there won't be life 100 years from now. It doesn't mean there won't be happiness and good life. It just will be a little different than we've experienced now, and with more challenges. The real question, of course, is can we prevent the most dire of future predictions from coming true? But how also, as planners, as people who are responsible for the future, how do we make decisions now that will make decisions easier for people on the ground today and also make life better for people 50, 100 years from now? And that's what this bill sought to do. And I'm going to continue to look for creative ways to think about these kinds of challenges and try to give tools to local and state government to help stave off these types of really tough decisions. I mean, give them tools to make better decisions in the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, as you know, we are running out of time, but we also still have time, especially with something like sea level rise. It is a relatively slow moving disaster, but we do have to act now. And I think we were talking about this before we started recording, but, I don't really run into climate denialists in California. I think the denial and the debate in California is time. How much time do we have left to do something about climate change? And, there are truly still people who think this is an issue that is a generation away and we don't need to make sacrifices today. And there are so many people who said we should have started decades ago and that we could indulge in some of the conversations we're having now if we had started in the 70s or 80s to talk about these issues. But yeah, I think, as you're talking, it's all coming back to me on the reporting of SB 83 and also the second version of your bill. But there was that study that you cited that said that for every dollar we spent before a disaster, we save $6
Absolutely.
In public money and taxpayer money on the back end. Because we're seeing this so frequently now with FEMA, with federal money, with state money, kind of responding to disasters.
It's so inefficient.
And yeah, it's an investment into our future. But again, that is not as necessarily politically appeasing to think that far into
Look
the future.
at the way we deal with healthcare, right? I mean, we spend
Yes.
so much money on people once they're on at death's door, and you think of the kind of upfront investments we could have made in preventative care.
Well, actually, to that point, in your book, you talk very much about the future and the challenge to mend our fractured relationship with the shore, as you put it, and re-educate ourselves. Ultimately, it's something we can do if we do it together. And you actually highlight young people. It is really young people that recognize the challenges that we have and are actually working together. So to your point about the future, it sounds like we got to do this together. And luckily, we have a younger generation coming up that takes it more seriously, leaves the ego on the shore, so to speak, and is actually working together to do this.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts here. I think there are a couple themes that have emerged in this conversation, but I will say it has been encouraging for me to the number of younger people that I have met and talked to who don't have this attachment to property in the same way as past generations, and also this notion of my land versus your land.
Right.
And I think there is almost this kind of return to the collective commons that dates back to indigenous wisdom and indigenous ways of living, but also, Justinian. It was really cool for me to rediscover kind of the Byzantine laws and, the air that we breathe, running water, the ocean itself, and the seashore under Justinian was also declared the public commons and no one can own it. And this idea idea, too, that I've been sensing from so many of the young people that I'm speaking today, this notion of being willing to personally sacrifice something for the greater good, like that sentiment, that through line, I feel is so present in kind of the conversations that I have with younger generations. And I do feel hope that that might guide us into these very complicated issues in a different way, or at least it will help us navigate some of like, how do we move forward? And it's also fascinating for me, and this is where I'm probably dating myself too. Like it's so many of this next generation is now entering politics. They're now joining as the youngest staffers of the Coastal Commission. They're becoming professors in academic spaces. And yeah, again, this idea of the collective commons, it's always existed. We've just kind of lost sight of that in so many of the ways we have made decisions today. But I have hope, and it's not like actually a radical change or a shift from how we philosophically had built our society today. We've just lost sight of some of the ability to see that it is not just about what's in it for me, and that we all do play a role in this greater good. And honestly, this willingness to share too, and recognizing the importance of sharing, also ultimately leads to a sense of responsibility, that we all have a role in what's at stake, and a responsibility and the ability to make things better.
And Senator, I'll let you comment on that too. I mean, ultimately, the future is in Ezra's hands. And I don't say that jokingly. I mean, really, it is his generation and those that are here and coming ahead that are going to make a difference.
Yeah, and we need to do everything we can to give them the space to make a difference. Because we really could go in so many different directions. I mean, you think about how much people care about taking action, and yet you also see us getting so distracted with culture wars and internal division, let alone massive global conflicts. I mean, this is the moment where humankind needs to come together, and yet look how much we're dividing ourselves, splitting apart, fighting each other. So it certainly is easy to get dispirited at times. I guess we can really draw inspiration from the folks that Rosanna talks about in the book, who were at a point in time where we were seeing the earth despoiled, the terrible oil spill that took place on the coast, and how that really galvanized people to take action and finally take the bull by the horns and do something meaningful for the future. And we've all been benefiting from it ever since. One of the things that's so scary about environmental destruction is that the human life is so short. We get used to things being a certain way. Young people growing up in the city don't know what it's like to see the stars. And it's an incredibly exciting thing to go off into the wilderness. There's fewer and fewer places where you can actually have a full night sky of stars. You talk about how people were able to experience wildlife on the beach. That's something I don't have a lot of experience with. Even when I grew up, occasional little rock pool with a sea star, but nothing like the profound biodiversity that some of the people you highlighted experienced when they first got to the beaches in the 50s and the 60s in California. And so one of the things I think it's always a challenge is as climate change becomes worse and worse, people grow up thinking that that's normal, that's how things are. And I think it's actually this generation right now that is in this cusp where they had a relationship with the pre-climate change world, and yet they know that they're going to be living in a climate change world for most of their lives, and they're, I think, most energized about trying to make things better, to ensure that we don't make things worse. And so it is a critical generation in that respect.
Just as you're saying this, it's reminding me of Jay Inslee's quote that President Obama famously quoted. I think the quote was, "We are the first generation to truly feel the consequences of climate change, and the last generation that can steer a different course." I mean, what we do in this generation, in this decade, honestly, is the make or break. We're hitting all of these tipping points and thresholds. And I think what you just said to baselines too, another term I hear a lot in the research space is this notion of shifting baselines. Our baseline for normal keeps changing. And what was really powerful for me just in the process of writing this book is meeting so many people from so many different generations who helped me reestablish what the baseline was and could be and should be. And we've lost sight of all of that because our baseline for normal keeps shifting, and we've become so normalized to even orange skies now. I feel like we've become, it's no longer even an Instagram effect now when our skies get so orange that we have to close all our windows and, not even turn on the air conditioning. And what you just said about stars is really, really heartbreaking, but truly, it's still possible to return to some of that if we do something now, if we steer a course now. And I'm just really moved by just what you just said.
And just as a final thought, speaking of a quote, I'll share one with you that you had in your book from an ecologist and engineer from Senegal. In the end, we will conserve only what we love love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. So ultimately, it's education, but it's also priorities of values. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to expand. That quote I was really moved by it when I first heard it,
yes.
But I also feel like the book kind of evolves in its interpretation of that quote, because so much of what we're stuck to is hanging on to the familiar and being afraid of change. And ultimately, this book was an exploration of our capacity for change and to encourage people to not be afraid of change. And a lot of that is teaching people to expand their minds and what it is that we could love and cherish, and also allowing people to let go of the things that feel safe, and to reframe this conversation not just as a conversation about what it is that we're going to lose in the face of climate change, but also what it is that we can gain and redesign and truly bring into the future in a way that is more equitable, that is more sustainable. And I do believe that all of this is possible, but these conversations need to happen now, not 20 years from now, and certainly not after the disaster hits.
And Senator, I'll give you the final word on that. Teaching people to value this will make it a priority for them to protect it.
Absolutely. It's one of the many tragedies that there's so many young Californians who live very close to the beach and have never been. And we do them such a disservice. We do ourselves a disservice. We do our society a disservice when we don't adequately invest in a high-quality education for these young people and a high-quality environmental education to ensure that we pass on this love of nature, the mystery, the spirituality of nature to the next generation. Because in the end of the day, it's going to be up to them to help preserve and protect these precious resources that we have. It's such an important part of being a Californian as we started our conversation, and yet we risk losing it if we don't have a population that fully appreciates what they have and wants to fight for it. And so that should motivate and animate much of our work going forward.
There's so many elements of this issue. We could talk till the next high tide about this issue, but I am truly grateful to both of you for your time and making time, this little scheduling coup of getting the environmental reporter and the senator together here in Southern California. Thank you both for being part of this. Rosanna, good luck with your book. I hope it seriously winds up as a textbook out there somewhere or on people's libraries for environmental study. And thank you so much for being part of this and sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you for creating the space to talk about this. We need to have so many more conversations like this.
Absolutely. We'll hope this will be the start. Senator, always good to see you. Good luck with the new year coming up. It's going to be a crazy one, I know, but I appreciate your wisdom always.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming down from Sacramento for this. Looking forward to seeing you up in the Capitol.
Oh, it's nice to be back here. Nice to see you both. State Senator Ben Allen, representing the 24th Senate District in Southern California, and Rosanna Shaw, LA Times reporter and author of this amazing book, California Against the Sea. And that's a wrap for Then There's California. It is a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus with technical and production support from John Roman, Brian Shadden, McLeana Woods, Michelle Baker, and the graphic artistry of Tim Davis. From Southern California in the 24th Coastal Senate District in Los Angeles County, I'm Brian Green. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.